boss pretends to be a new hire at the company, and what he hears changes his life forever. Richard Williams never imagined he'd one day dress in simple clothes to enter his own company, pretending to be just another new employee. At 58, the silver-haired businessman had completely lost touch with the reality of those who worked for him. It was when he introduced himself as Richard Smith, a new hire for the administrative department, that everything began to change. The young Tyler Johnson, just 25 years old, was assigned to welcome him and show him the company's procedures. "Hello, Richard. Welcome to the team," Tyler said with a genuine smile, extending his hand. "I'll be with you today to show you how things work around here." Richard shook the young man's hand, feeling a mix of nervousness and curiosity. It had been years since he'd stepped foot on the operational floors of his own company. "Thank you, Tyler. I'm eager to learn," he replied, trying to sound natural. As they walked through the halls, Tyler explained the basic routines, but Richard noticed something different in the young man's tone. There was a tension in the air he'd never noticed before. "Listen, Richard, you seem like a good guy," Tyler said, lowering his voice. "Can I give you some advice? Around here, you've got to be careful about a few things." Richard's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "There's a manager here, Michael Thompson. Well, let's just say he's not the easiest to deal with. If you cross paths with him, it's best to stay quiet and do exactly what he says." Richard's stomach twisted. Michael Thompson was one of the managers he himself had promoted 2 years ago, based solely on productivity reports. "Is he really that bad?" Richard asked, trying to sound merely curious. Tyler glanced around before answering. "Last week, he made Mrs. Thompson cry in front of everyone because she asked to leave early for a doctor's appointment. The woman is 52, has worked here for 15 years, and he yelled at her like she was a child." Richard's legs went weak. Margaret was an exemplary employee he only knew from annual reports. He never imagined she could be going through this. "And no one does anything?" he asked, trying to control the anger in his voice. "Do what? Michael's got connections with the board. They say he delivers great numbers every month," Tyler sighed. "Those of us who work here know it's all smoke and mirrors, but who's going to believe us?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out as we're just starting. Now, back to the story. They arrived at the cafeteria during lunch. Richard watched as employees sat in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. There was a heavy atmosphere he'd never noticed during his rare official visits to the floor. "Come on, I'll introduce you to everyone," Tyler said, heading toward a table where 3 women were chatting. "Ladies, this is Richard, our new colleague from admin," Tyler announced. The 3 women looked at Richard with curiosity, but there was a hint of wariness in their eyes. "Hi, Richard," said one, a woman around 45 with curly hair. "I'm Melissa. I've been in finance for 8 years." "Nice to meet you, Melissa," Richard smiled, trying to seem at ease. "You don't sound like you're from New York," remarked another younger woman, who introduced herself as Jennifer. "Actually, I'm from out of town. Came to try my luck in the city," Richard lied, sticking to the story he'd prepared. "Well, just know it's not easy here," said the third woman, around 60, named Irene. "If you want advice from someone who's been around, keep your head down and don't get involved with the injustices you'll see here." Richard swallowed hard. "What kind of injustices?" The 3 women exchanged meaningful glances. "Tell him, Irene," whispered Melissa. "He'll find out anyway." Irene took a deep breath. "My paycheck is 2 months late. Melissa's too, and we're not the only ones." Richard nearly choked on his coffee. "Late? How?" "Michael always has a different excuse," Melissa explained. "That the banking system is having issues, that the company is waiting for a big payment, that it's just a few more days." "But I need my money," Irene said, her eyes welling up. "My husband's been out of work for 6 months, and I'm the only one supporting us. Yesterday I didn't even have enough to buy his blood pressure medication." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His company had enough cash reserves to cover payroll for months. How could paychecks be late? "What if you went to the owner?" Richard suggested, trying to sound naive. The 3 women laughed bitterly. "Richard Williams?" Jennifer said. "That man hasn't set foot here in years. Rumor has it he doesn't even know we exist. Richard's world spun. Is that what his employees thought of him? He's probably up in his penthouse in the Upper East Side, only worried about the money hitting his account, Irene added bitterly. People like us are just numbers to him. Irene, don't say that, Melissa pleaded, glancing around nervously. What if someone hears? Let them hear, Irene shot back. I'm done pretending everything's fine. 43 years of work, only to reach 60 and be humiliated by some kid like Michael. Richard could barely breathe. 43 years. That meant Irene had started working as a teenager to help support her family. And now, when she should be preparing for a dignified retirement, she was struggling because of the irresponsibility of someone he'd put in charge. Forgive me for asking, Richard said, steadying his voice, but have you ever thought about finding another job? At my age, Irene laughed sadly. Who's going to hire a 60-year-old woman when they can get a 20-year-old? Besides, Melissa added, where else would we get the same pay? As bad as it is here, it's still better than most places. Tyler, who had stayed quiet until now, leaned forward. Richard, there's something you need to know. When you fill out those satisfaction surveys they send every month, never ever be honest. Why? Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. Because they say it's anonymous, but it's not, Jennifer murmured. Ryan from IT told some friends they can track who says what. Any criticism ends up on Michael's desk. Richard remembered the satisfaction surveys he received monthly in his office. They always showed sky-high employee satisfaction rates. He'd even used those numbers in investor presentations, proud of the work environment he thought he'd created. What happens to people who tell the truth? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Frank from the warehouse was fired last month, Melissa said. Officially, it was for cause. They claimed he was stealing supplies, but everyone knows it was because he complained in the survey about late pay. Frank was one of the most honest men here, Irene added. 30 years with the company, not a single complaint. Suddenly he's a thief. Impossible. Richard's head swam. Frank was an employee he knew by name from reports, always listed among the top performers. How was it possible he'd been fired for cause without even knowing? Hey guys, said Tyler, checking his watch. We need to head back. Lunch break is over. As they walked back to the office, Richard walked in silence, processing everything he'd just heard. Tyler seemed to notice his discomfort. So sorry if we scared you, the young man said. I didn't want you starting here without knowing how things are, but it's not all bad, okay? There are good people here too. It's just that we've kind of learned to protect ourselves. Protect yourselves from what? Asked Richard. Tyler stopped in front of a glass-walled office where a man in a dark suit was aggressively gesturing at a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. From that, Tyler whispered. Richard recognized Michael Thompson immediately. The manager he himself had promoted was yelling at an intern, jabbing his finger in her face while other employees pretended to be busy at their computers. How many times do I have to tell you to check the numbers before sending me anything? Michael shouted. Do you think I have nothing better to do than fix mistakes from incompetent interns? The young woman was clearly fighting back tears, her hands shaking as she shuffled papers on the desk. I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. It was a silly mistake. It won't happen again, she murmured. Silly mistake? Michael scoffed. Do you know how much a silly mistake costs a company? You interns think this is school, where you can mess up and try again. Richard watched the scene with growing horror. The young woman was being publicly humiliated over something that was clearly a minor error. He could see on the other employees' faces a mix of sympathy for the intern and relief that it wasn't them in her place. I should fire you right now, Michael continued, but I'll give you one more chance. If it happens again, you can find somewhere else to learn how to work. When Michael finally stormed into his office, the intern collapsed into her chair, visibly shaken. A co-worker approached and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Does this happen often? Richard asked Tyler, struggling to keep his voice steady. Almost every day, Tyler replied sadly. Ashley's a really hard-working girl, but Michael seems to take pleasure in humiliating her. And it's not just her. Richard felt a rage building inside him like never before. That young woman could have been his own daughter. How had he let his company become a place where people were treated like this? "Tyler," Michael called from his office door, "bring the new guy in. I want to meet him." Richard's blood ran cold. He wasn't ready for a face-to-face with Michael, especially after what he'd just witnessed. "Good luck," Tyler whispered as he led him to the office. Michael sat behind an imposing desk with multiple diplomas and certificates lining the walls. Richard noticed some were from courses the company itself had sponsored. "So you're Richard Smith," Michael said, looking Richard up and down with a superior expression. "How old are you?" 58, Richard replied, trying to maintain the submissive posture he'd rehearsed. Michael laughed. 58 and still job hunting. "What happened? Get fired from your last place?" Richard swallowed his anger. "Actually, I decided to switch fields, worked too long in one place, and wanted a new challenge." "New challenge?" Michael laughed again. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This isn't the place for people who want coddling with challenges. We need folks who do what they're told without question. Think you can handle that?" Richard nodded, fighting against every instinct to put that man in his place. "Great, but let me tell you something." Michael leaned forward, his tone turning threatening. "I have no patience for problematic employees. If you start talking about labor rights, lunch breaks, or anything that gets in the way of productivity, you can look for another job the same day, understood?" "Understood," Richard murmured. "And one more thing," Michael continued. "I know the old-timers like to poison new hires with complaints and gossip. If anyone fills your head with nonsense about the company, you tell me. I won't tolerate negativity being spread around." Richard left Michael's office with shaky legs. In just 15 minutes, he'd perfectly understood why his employees lived in constant fear. "So how'd it go?" Tyler asked when Richard returned. "Well, educational," Richard replied, still processing the experience. "Did he give you the problematic employee speech?" Tyler laughed humorlessly. "He says that to every new hire, just to make it clear from the start who's in charge here." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of increasingly disturbing discoveries. Richard watched Michael constantly interrupt employees, criticize their work without constructive feedback, and make demeaning comments about their age and competence. When the workday finally ended, Richard walked to the parking lot with his head spinning. He'd only spent one day undercover and already seen enough to completely reshape his view of his own company. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, back to the story. On his way home, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. How had he become so disconnected from his employees' reality? How had he allowed someone like Michael to gain so much power? The next morning, Richard returned to the company determined to understand the full extent of the problems. He arrived early and went straight to the break room, where he found some cleaning staff having coffee before their shift. "Good morning, ladies," Richard greeted cautiously. "Good morning," replied one of them, a grey-haired woman who looked about his age. "You're the new guy from admin, right? Margaret told me about you." Richard nodded. "That's right. Mind if I join you for coffee?" The women exchanged surprised glances, but made room for him to sit. "Nobody here usually talks to us cleaners," the woman, who introduced herself as Angela, remarked. "It's nice to see someone polite around here." "We all work in the same place," Richard said. "We're all colleagues, aren't we?" Angela smiled for the first time. "Hope you still feel that way after being here a while." "Why do you talk like this place is bad?" Richard asked, trying to sound genuinely curious. The women exchanged looks again. Richard could see them deciding whether to trust him. "Look, Richard," said Margaret, the woman Tyler had mentioned the day before, "I've worked here 15 years. I've seen a lot of changes in this company. But the last 2 years..." She shook her head. "What changed?" Richard asked, though he suspected it coincided with Michael's promotion. "The atmosphere got heavy," Angela explained. "Before we could talk to the bosses, there was respect. Now everyone lives in fear." "Fear of what?" "Getting fired over any little thing," said a third woman, younger, who introduced herself as Rose. "Last week, I almost got fired because Michael thought I was taking too long to clean his office." Richard leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "He said I was slacking off, that 5 minutes was enough time to clean any office. Rose still seemed shaken by the memory. But his office is huge, full of furniture. How am I supposed to clean it properly in 5 minutes? And did you explain that to him? Rose laughed bitterly. Explain to Michael. He doesn't listen to anyone, just yells and threatens. Margaret placed a hand on Rose's shoulder. Tell him what happened when you tried to explain. Rose swallowed hard. He said if I couldn't do my job right, he'd find someone who could. That people my age should be grateful to have a job. Richard felt his anger rising again. Rose couldn't be older than 25. What kind of comment was that? People your age? But you're young. Exactly, said Rose. But for Michael, anything is an excuse to humiliate. If you're young, you're inexperienced. If you're older, you're outdated. If you're a woman, you're weak. He always finds a flaw. Angela sighed. The worst part is we have nowhere to turn. Michael says he has free rein from the board, that as long as the company's numbers are good, no one will question his methods. Richard nearly choked. He said that? At the last meeting, Margaret confirmed. He said the owner only cares about profit, and as long as he delivered results, he could do whatever he wanted with the employees. Richard felt as if he'd been stabbed. Was this what Michael was telling the employees? That he, Richard, didn't care about their well-being? Do you believe that? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Honestly, Angela said after a pause, I don't know what to believe anymore. The owner of this company has never come to talk to us, never asked if we're okay. The only thing we see are his expensive cars in the executive parking lot. Richard remembered the 3 cars he kept at the company, a Lexus, a Cadillac, and a Tesla he used occasionally. He'd never considered how that might look like unnecessary flaunting to those earning minimum wage. Maybe he doesn't even know what's happening, Richard suggested. Oh, he knows, Rose said firmly. Michael said he sends reports to the board every week. If everything's running smoothly, it's because the boss approves of his methods. Richard left that conversation even more shaken than the day before. Not only were his employees suffering, but they believed he knew and endorsed it all. For the rest of the week, Richard continued his undercover investigation. He discovered the delayed payments were a deliberate tactic by Michael to keep employees desperate and submissive. The money was there, but Michael made excuses to delay it by up to 3 months. He also found out Michael had created a system of favorites. Employees who publicly agreed with his methods and reported co-workers for any complaints received small privileges and had their salaries paid on time. Richard watched Michael humiliate a pregnant employee for needing more bathroom breaks, saw him mock an older worker for not fully understanding a new computer system, witnessed him threaten a single mother with termination for asking to leave early to pick up her sick child from school. Each discovery felt like a knife to Richard's heart. How had he let his company become this? How had he grown so distant from the reality of the people working for him? By Friday of the first week, Richard decided he needed to better understand the employee's true financial situation. During lunch, he approached a group chatting in the courtyard. Hi everyone, Richard greeted. Mind if I join you? The group, made up of 4 men of varying ages, made room for him. Of course, Richard, said one of them, a man around 40 named Charles. How's your first week going? Quite different from what I expected, Richard answered honestly. I bet, laughed another man, younger, named Peter. It always takes a while to get used to Michael's way of doing things. Speaking of him, did you hear he fired Joe yesterday? Commented a third older man. Richard's stomach tightened. Fired him? Why? Officially for low productivity, Charles explained, but everyone knows the real reason. Which was? Richard asked. The men exchanged glances before Peter replied. Joe complained that he couldn't afford his mother's medicine because his paycheck was late. Michael overheard and said employees who whine about money are trouble. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Joe was a 45-year-old who'd worked at the company for 10 years. He had an elderly mother with diabetes who relied on expensive medication. So what now? What's going to happen to his mother? Richard asked, genuinely concerned. Who knows, Charles sighed. Joe's desperate. At 45, finding another job that pays the same won't be easy. And the worst part, Peter added, is that he was one of our best employees. Always helped everyone, never complained about overtime. but all it took was mentioning the late paycheck once. Richard could barely process it. A model employee had been fired for worrying about his mother's health. How was that possible? "Can't you do anything? Isn't there a union or something?" Richard asked. "The union rep here is friends with Michael," explained the oldest man, who introduced himself as Oscar. "Any complaint we make goes straight to his desk." "And even if it went further," Charles added, "Michael always finds an official reason for firings. Tardiness, low productivity, misconduct. On paper, he's always in the right." Richard spent the weekend thinking about everything he'd learned. On Monday, he decided to dig deeper into the financial issues. He requested documents he had the right to access as an administrative employee. That's when he uncovered the most shocking truth of all. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us newcomers out. Now back to it. Michael had been systematically embezzling company funds. Not only was he delaying employee paychecks, but he was also overcharging suppliers and pocketing the difference. On top of that, he was selling company materials to third parties and keeping the profits for himself. Richard found spreadsheets showing how Michael manipulated numbers to make it seem like the company was barely breaking even, justifying the late pay, when in reality it was turning a healthy profit. But the most devastating discovery came when Richard stumbled upon a group chat on the company phone Michael had left open. The messages were between Michael and managers from partner companies, arranging schemes to blacklist troublesome employees. Anyone who complained too much at one company was barred from getting hired at any of the others in the group. Joe was on that list. Along with 15 other employees Richard recognized as capable, honest people who'd been fired over the past 2 years. Richard was reading the messages when he heard footsteps approaching. He quickly closed his phone and pretended to be working on other things. "Richard," Michael called from the doorway, "can you come here for a minute?" Richard felt his heart race. Had Michael discovered who he really was? "Of course," Richard replied, trying to sound natural. In Michael's office, Richard found 2 men he didn't recognize. "Richard, these are Mr. Arnold and Mr. Jack, directors from 2 of our partner companies," Michael said. "They came here for a meeting and I told them about our new employee." Richard greeted the 2 men, trying not to show his nervousness. "Michael mentioned you have administrative experience," Arnold said. "How old are you again?" 58, Richard answered. "And why did you leave your last job?" Jack asked suspiciously. Richard repeated the story he'd made up about wanting new challenges, but he could tell from the men's expressions they weren't entirely convinced. "You know, Richard," Michael said slowly, "we have very strict policies here about employees. We don't tolerate people who cause problems or spread negativity." "I understand," Richard said. "I hope you do," Michael continued, "because if we find out you're not who you say you are, or if you're here with some hidden agenda, you'll be fired on the spot. And not just fired, you'll be blacklisted from all companies in our group." Richard felt his blood run cold. Were they onto him? "I don't understand," Richard said, trying to sound confused. "What hidden agenda could I possibly have?" "Oh, you'd be surprised," Arnold chuckled. "We've had people pose as employees to spy on the company before. Journalists, union reps, even relatives of fired employees trying to dig up information. And when we find those people," Jack added, "they deeply regret trying to deceive us." Richard left that meeting certain Michael and his partners suspected him. He needed to speed up his investigation before they uncovered his true identity. That afternoon, Richard decided to talk to Ashley, the intern he'd seen being humiliated on his first day. She was in the file room, organizing documents alone. "Hi, Ashley," Richard greeted softly. "How are you?" The young woman glanced around nervously before answering. "Hi, Richard, I'm fine, thanks." Richard could tell she was lying. Ashley had deep, dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. "How old are you?" 21, Ashley replied. "And how long have you been here?" 3 months, she sighed. "But it feels like an eternity." Richard moved a little closer. "Ashley, I know we haven't known each other long, but you seem like a very smart, hard-working young woman. Why do you put up with the way Michael treats you?" Ashley's eyes filled with tears. "Because I need this internship." "What do you mean?" I'm studying business at a private college. My parents are struggling to pay tuition and I need the internship certificate to graduate. Ashley wiped away a stray tear. If I leave here, I might not find another internship in time. Then I'd have to drop out. Richard's heart ached. Ashley was being exploited and humiliated because she had no choice. Do your parents know how you're treated here? I can't tell them, Ashley said quickly. They're already sacrificing so much to keep me in school. If they knew I was suffering here, they'd tell me to quit. But I can't give up on my dream just because of a bad boss. Richard looked at that young woman and saw in her eyes the same determination he had when he started working at 16. The difference was, back in his day, there were still bosses who valued that determination instead of exploiting it. Ashley, I can promise you one thing, Richard said with conviction. Men like Michael don't last forever. Sooner or later, the truth about them comes out. You think so? Ashley asked, a spark of hope in her eyes. I'm sure of it, Richard replied. And when that happens, people like you, who kept their dignity even when mistreated, will finally be recognized for what you're truly worth. That night, Richard barely slept. He couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't while people like Ashley, Irene, Joe, and so many others suffered because of his negligence as a leader. By Tuesday, Richard decided it was time to act. But before revealing his identity, he needed one final piece of proof of Michael's behavior. At lunch, Richard hid near Michael's office and waited. It didn't take long to see what he was looking for. Michael was yelling at someone over the phone, and Richard could hear the conversation through the slightly open door. I don't care if his mother is in the hospital, Michael shouted. If he can't stick to his schedule because of personal issues, that's his problem, not mine. Richard realized Michael was talking about an employee who needed time off to care for family. Listen here, Michael continued. If you can't do your job right because you're worried about a sick relative, then you don't belong here. That's how the real world works. Richard heard the phone slam down. Minutes later, he saw one of the finance department employees leave the room with tears in his eyes. It was Paul, a man around 35 whom Richard had seen a few times that week. Richard followed him to the restroom. Paul, are you okay? Richard asked as they entered the empty bathroom. Paul looked at Richard with red-rimmed eyes. My mother's been in the hospital for 3 days. She had a stroke and is in the ICU. I just asked to leave an hour early to visit her. And Michael said no? Worse than that, Paul openly cried now. He said if I leave today, I shouldn't bother coming back tomorrow, that people who aren't committed to work don't belong here. Richard felt such intense anger that he had to steady himself against the sink to keep control. Paul, how old is your mother? 68. She raised me and my 2 brothers alone after my father died. Worked her whole life as a cleaner so we could get an education, Paul sobbed. And now when she needs me, I can't even visit her in the hospital. Richard couldn't hold back anymore. Paul, trust me, go see your mother, now. But Michael, leave Michael to me, Richard said, with a determination that surprised even himself. Paul looked at him confused, but there was something in the older man's voice that calmed him. Are you sure? Absolutely. Go to the hospital and stay as long as your mother needs you. I'll take responsibility for any consequences. When Paul left, Richard returned to his workstation, his mind racing. He couldn't wait any longer. It was time to end this. Richard took out his personal phone and called his lawyer. Mr. Harrison, it's Richard Williams. I need you at the company now. Bring all the documentation on owner authority and prepare termination papers for just cause. Richard, what's going on? You're at the company? I'll explain later. Just get here fast and bring everything I asked for. Oh, and call the accountant too. We'll need a full audit. After hanging up, Richard headed straight for Michael's office. It was time to end this charade. Richard knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. Michael, I need to talk to you. Michael looked up, annoyed by the interruption. Richard, I didn't ask you to come in. Learn to knock and wait for permission. Sit down and I'll teach you something about permission, Richard said, closing the door behind him. Something in Richard's tone made Michael lift his eyes from the papers and look at him more carefully. Excuse me. Richard approached the desk and placed both hands on it, staring directly into Michael's eyes. I told you to sit down and pay attention because you'll need all your concentration to understand what's about to happen in the next few minutes. Michael was confused by Richard's sudden change in demeanor. "Hey, are you okay? Who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" Richard smiled for the first time in a week. "That's an excellent question, Michael. Who do I think I am?" At that moment, Richard heard a knock at the door. "Come in," he said. Mr. Harrison entered the room, followed by the company accountant, both carrying folders full of documents. "Good afternoon, Richard," Mr. Harrison greeted. "We brought everything you asked for." Michael looked from Mr. Harrison to Richard, completely lost. "Richard, what's going on? How do you know the company lawyer?" Richard straightened up and looked at Michael with all the authority he had gathered in his 60 years of life. "Michael Thompson. My name isn't Richard Smith. My name is Richard Williams, and I own this company." The silence that followed was so deep, Richard could hear his own heartbeat. Michael turned pale as a sheet, his mouth hanging open as he tried to process what he had just heard. That's not possible," Michael stammered. "Mr. Harrison, would you show him my documentation?" Richard asked calmly. The lawyer opened a folder and placed several documents on the desk: birth certificate, ID, company papers, power of attorney, all proving that Richard Smith was, in fact, Richard Williams. Michael looked at the documents with trembling hands. "But why would you do this?" "Because for years I've wondered why my company had such high employee satisfaction rates, but also an increasing turnover," Richard explained. "Because I wanted to understand why competent employees were quitting without any apparent reason. And most of all, because I wanted to find out why, despite all the positive reports you sent me, I was losing more and more contracts with long-time clients." Michael tried to stand up, but Richard motioned for him to stay seated. "I'm not done yet. For a week I watched you humiliate employees daily. I saw you deliberately delay paychecks for people who depend on that money to survive. I saw you fire competent employees for personal reasons and make up false justifications." "Mr. Richard, I can explain," Michael began. "Explain what?" Richard interrupted. "How you threatened a 21-year-old intern who needs this job to graduate. How you denied an employee the right to visit his mother in the ICU. How you set up a blacklist with other companies to keep fired employees from finding new jobs." Michael turned even paler. "How do you know about the scheme?" Richard picked up the company phone Michael had left unlocked. "Because you forgot this phone open, and I read all your messages. Mr. Harrison, can you photograph these conversations? We'll need them as evidence." As the lawyer photographed the messages, Richard continued. "But the worst discovery was what you did with the finances. Mr. Morrison, would you show him what we found?" The accountant opened his folder and spread spreadsheets across the desk. "Mr. Michael, this is the evidence that you embezzled over $200,000 from the company in the last 2 years. Inflated contracts, undeclared sales of materials, manipulation of financial reports." Michael was breaking into a cold sweat now. I can return the money." "Oh, you will," said Richard. "At the police station, when you give your statement for embezzlement." Mr. Harrison stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, here is your termination letter for just cause and a notice that the company will file criminal charges against you for misappropriation of funds and workplace harassment." Michael tried one last desperate move. "Mr. Richard, this is all a misunderstanding. I always wanted what was best for the company. The productivity numbers, the numbers," Richard laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about numbers? Let me show you some interesting numbers." Richard picked up a folder he had prepared. "In the 2 years since you were promoted to manager, our company lost 15 major contracts. Know why? Because our best employees left or were fired, and our service quality plummeted." Richard continued. "Employee turnover increased by 300%. Recruitment and training costs tripled. And our reputation in the market is so damaged that new clients won't even consider our services." "But the monthly reports showed—" "They showed lies," Richard interrupted. "Because you manipulated the data and intimidated employees into giving positive feedback on satisfaction surveys." At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Richard opened it to find 2 officers Mr. Harrison had called. "Officers, this is Michael Thompson. We have evidence that he committed embezzlement and conspired to harm terminated employees." Michael staggered to his feet. "Mr. Richard, for God's sake. I have a family. I have children." Richard looked at him with a mix of anger and pity. "Michael, Paul has a family too. His mother is in the ICU, and you wouldn't let him visit her. Joe had a diabetic mother who relied on expensive medication he couldn't afford because you delayed his pay. Ashley is a 21-year-old girl you humiliated daily. All these people have families," Richard continued, "and you destroyed their lives without a second thought. Now you'll answer for your actions." As the officers led Michael away, Richard sat in the manager's chair and took his first deep breath in a week. "Mr. Harrison, call a company-wide meeting. It's time they know the truth." An hour later, Richard stood before all the employees. He saw confusion on some faces, fear on others, and a glimmer of hope in a few. "Everyone, my name isn't Richard Smith," Richard began. "My name is Richard Williams, and I own this company." A murmur spread through the crowd. Richard saw shock on the faces of Tyler, Irene, Margaret, Ashley, and all the others. "For the past week, I pretended to be a new employee to understand what's really happening here, and what I discovered shamed me deeply." Richard paused, looking into each person's eyes. "I found out you've been mistreated, humiliated, and exploited by someone I trusted. I found out your pay was deliberately delayed. I found out competent employees were fired for personal reasons, and I found out you believed I knew and approved of all this. I apologize to every one of you," Richard continued, his voice trembling. "As the leader of this company, I failed you. I became so detached from daily operations that I allowed a man without integrity to turn your workplace into a living hell." Richard took a deep breath before finishing. "But that ends today. Michael Thompson was fired for just cause and will face criminal charges for the crimes he committed. Mr. Harrison, can you explain the measures we'll be taking?" The lawyer stepped forward. "Starting today, all overdue salaries will be paid with monetary correction and interest. The company will create a completely anonymous and independent whistleblower channel. There will be monthly audits to ensure situations like this never happen again. Additionally," Richard continued, "we'll hire a firm specialized in organizational culture to help rebuild a healthy work environment. And I, personally, will spend at least 2 hours a week on the operational floors, talking with you and understanding your needs." Richard looked directly at a few individuals. "Paul, you're free to take as much time as you need to care for your mother. The company will cover her treatment costs. Joe, if you want to come back, your position is guaranteed with a promotion and a raise. Ashley, you're no longer an intern. Starting tomorrow, you're a full-time employee with full salary." Tears were visible on many faces. Richard went on, "Irene, Margaret, Angela, and all the cleaning staff will receive a 30% salary increase and full health coverage for you and your families. Tyler, you'll be promoted to training supervisor for new hires because you've shown the integrity and courage I want leading this company." Richard paused one last time before finishing. "I know it'll take time to rebuild your trust. I know some wounds will take longer to heal, but I promise each of you that starting today, this company will be a place where you feel valued, respected, and heard. My office door will always be open, not for complaints about work, but for conversations about how we can improve together. Because I've learned a lesson I'll never forget. A company isn't made of numbers or reports. A company is made of people, and you are the most important people in this company." When Richard finished speaking, there was silence for a few seconds. Then, slowly, applause began. First from Tyler, then Irene, then everyone else. It wasn't obligatory applause. It was filled with relief, hope, and gratitude. In the months that followed, the company's transformation was remarkable. With Michael gone and Richard present, the workplace atmosphere improved drastically. Employee turnover dropped to almost zero, productivity rose by 40%, and new contracts started coming in. Ashley graduated college and became one of the best employees in the administrative department. Paul was able to care for his mother, who fully recovered from her stroke. Joe returned and was promoted to warehouse coordinator. Irene, at 60 years old, found new energy for work when she realized her experience was valued, not dismissed. Tyler became Richard's right hand, helping implement fairer HR policies. Richard never forgot the lessons he learned during that week undercover. He kept his promise to spend regular time with employees, and the company became a model of humane management in the industry. But the biggest change was in Richard himself. He had rediscovered that leadership isn't about commanding from afar. It's about being present and truly listening to the people who build the company's success every day. Years later, whenever Richard told this story, he always ended with the same reflection. Sometimes we need to pretend to be someone else to discover who we really are. End of story. And now, dear listener, tell us, do you believe Richard made the right decisions? Have you ever experienced a similar situation at work? Leave your honest opinion in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming stories.